Just pick the first one. I don't care which one it is, but if we are going based on what she said, then the implication is there. I just don't know that I'd look at that man and go like, yeah, lick me up, daddy. He is quite translucent. No, Isabella's dog was not hung in the film, but she is the dog. I can't claim that I am making Wuthering Heights. I know that if somebody else made it, I'd be furious. At this point in time, I think it's safe to say that when the first teaser for Emerald Fennell's Wuthering Heights dropped, the internet fractured. Some viewers were scandalized and outraged that Emily Bronte's gritty, philosophical, metaphysical novel seemed to be repackaged into something more aesthetic, glossy, and erotic, stripped of the themes that made it a classic to begin with. Others were hopeful that Fennell's flair, evident in her latest work Saltburn, would breathe new life into a text typically adapted with very little imagination. The controversy was pretty immediate. Margot Robbie, who's significantly older than the juvenile Catherine, who dies at the age of 19 in the book, was cast to play Catherine Earnshaw, not to mention that the physical similarities were not present, while Jacob Elordi, an Australian white actor, was cast to play Heathcliff, a character the novel consistently uses racialized language to describe. The pushback got even worse when Fennell herself admitted that a lot of her Wuthering Heights had callbacks to Gone with the Wind, not only in the imagery of the posters, which when looked side by side are eerily similar, but in the film's cinematography too, where certain shots look quite similar to that of Gone with the Wind, which is all fascinating and did not go unnoticed because Gone with the Wind is infamously a movie that romanticizes the antebellum South, slavery, and racist stereotypes. So it was something else to add to the ongoing list of things that were already playing against this adaptation. So naturally, picture my surprise as somebody who considers Wuthering Heights as one of her favorite classics, but also somebody who quite quickly got exposed to all of this information on the internet before the film even released, when I got an invitation from Warner Brothers to attend an early screening of the film. I knew I could not miss that opportunity because I needed to witness that mess firsthand and have the best house seat I possibly could. So of course I went. And ultimately what I ended up discovering is not just a controversial adaptation of Wuthering Heights, but rather a movie that completely misunderstands the thematic core of the material it is attempting to adapt. But don't worry, because Emerald Fennell has an explanation for this herself, because in an interview she describes Wuthering Heights as her favorite book in the whole world. She admits she could never hope to encompass its greatness. Instead, she explains she could only attempt to make a movie that made her feel the way the book made her feel. So you can only ever kind of make the movie that you imagined yourself when you read it. And if you've been anywhere on the internet since September 3rd when the first teaser trailer released, then you would know people have got a lot to say over what she imagined on that first reading experience when she was 14 years old. What I find fascinating is that Emerald Fennell consistently describes herself as quite fanatical over Wuthering Heights. Even on an interview conversation with Baz Luhrmann, she claims to have read the novel upwards of 100 times, which for my own sanity, I will only assume is hyperbolic. Honestly, that to me is quite unimportant because what matters is that the level of engagement she alleges to have with the novel is not entirely present on screen, to the point of stating that Jacob Elordi's casting uniquely happened after she saw him with the sideburns in Saltburn, and he looked exactly like the man on the cover of the copy she initially read when she was a teenager. So at this point, by her own admission, the adaptation is less an interpretation of the text, but rather a preservation of adolescent vision. Her vision is not at all concerned with adapting the novel's commentary on class, inheritance, social hierarchy, the subject of otherness in all of its different forms, but specifically through the metaphysical and philosophical, which are some of the most important elements of Wuthering Heights, and not even the imperial anxiety that seems to plague this plot in the same way that it did England at the time of Bronte writing this novel. If you ask me my personal opinion, I think her vision is more concerned with romanticizing obsession and packaging Heathcliff as a tragic lover who yearns for a woman that is kept away from him by the only two people of color. There is an entirely separate conversation this could lead into about implicit biases choices that I cannot state for sure are a part of Fennell's vision of the film. I do think it speaks a lot of her privileges and how she grew up more likely than not, and the people that she surrounds herself with. And if we put all these things together, the promotional narrative leading up to its theatrical release seems less a defense of Bronte's themes, which have had to be consistently defended over the past 178 years since the novel came out, and more a justification and defense of personal vision. So it ends up being funny how a reverence for the novel is repeatedly stated in all of these different interviews, which seems very much pre-thought, pre-planned out, almost as if it's trying to be apologetic or trying to justify something because they know the criticism they will face, but only its surface is adapted. Today I'm not here to spread my word as law. God knows it's certainly not. There are so many ways to interpret the text, evidently, as we see with the adaptation, but I am mostly here to establish a conversation with you guys, see what you think and how you feel about the adaptation, whether you have read the book and watched the film, or if you've consumed either or what your perception is of the whole thing. I would love to hear you guys out in the comment section, because the question that keeps coming up for me mentally is what happens when we remove systems, inheritance, and ontology from the story? Because whether or not Fennell's creative choices work or not for the sake of the film depends entirely on what you consider Wuthering Heights to be about. I truly think this process has made me realize how impractical I am with certain matters, because instead of looking up a synopsis of the film, which very well exists, I am sure, I went to the movie theater to go watch this movie a second time, this time with my brother, also somebody who has never consumed anything Wuthering Heights related, and see if the movie worked for them instead. And he ended up rating the movie 1 star, and that was shocking to me because I genuinely thought he would at least give it maybe a 3. Apparently nothing worked either, which was more than interesting to realize that it wasn't just me the movie did not work for. Naturally, you know, I'm walking into the movie theater, I realize the movie theater is empty. There is not a single soul sitting in the movie theater with us. So I take out my phone and I just start jotting down notes, which evidently turned into this. The film opens up with a public execution. A man is being hung in the town square, and Catherine Earnshaw, our main character, is there to witness it, with who in the movie is her companion, Nellie Dean, instead of what we traditionally know of Nellie in the book, which is that she is a maid within the Earnshaw household. I fail to comprehend exactly what about a public execution is erotic, but after this man is hung, people get horny in the town square to the point where people start giving each other hand jobs and they're feeling each other up and kissing and moaning. But enter Charlie XCX, because surely if this scene doesn't make sense, we can cover it up with music to make sure that we replace its lack of depth with a lot of intensity. After this public execution, we go back to Wuthering Heights, the estate that Kathy, Nellie, and the rest of the servants and her father live in. There is the removal of Hindley in the film, who in the novel is Catherine's brother. So Hindley's cruelty and Hindley's progression as a character is then projected onto Mr. Earnshaw, because the film has to, in some way, shape, or form, exemplify how exactly these characters get to be so cruel and abusive in a movie that doesn't quite display the abuse in the way that the book does. Therefore, Catherine's father, Mr. Earnshaw, ends up being an abusive, gambling alcoholic in the film, who on a trip back from Liverpool brings back a young boy who he presents to Catherine as her newest pet. She decides she's going to name him Heathcliff after a dead brother, which then also means that a lot of the bonding Catherine and Heathcliff do when they are younger is not through a sense of kindred spirits or a connection that far surpasses that of the physical realm, but rather a lot of it boils down to Heathcliff protecting Catherine from her father's abuse, where in a scene we literally see him tell Nellie to take Catherine away because he's about to get beat up by Papa Earnshaw. The movie is literal in all ways and leaves nothing up for the imagination. It's very concerned with being explicit in every sense of the word, to a point where we get a scene where Catherine and Heathcliff are talking to each other, and Catherine tells him that they are doomed if he is willing to do anything to protect her, which again frames Heathcliff as something more tortured and tragic rather than somebody who is calculating and resentful and a result of his childhood. After this, we have the obvious time skip where we now get Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi taking the mantle as Catherine and Heathcliff in adulthood. The movie immediately leaves it understood that their relationship is built on a lot of intimacy and yearning for each other. It is also worth noting that at this point in the film, Heathcliff is working as a servant, and we don't entirely understand why. It just exists within those parameters in the movie, which again is very different from the novel, where we know Hindley is the one that demotes Heathcliff to servantry because he then takes up the mantle of the household after Mr. Earnshaw dies. So the book is very intentional in terms of who demotes Heathcliff and the reasons why it is done. In the film, it just happens to be that way, and it is around this point in the film where we learn that the Lintons have moved into Thrushcross Grange, a manor about 5 miles out from Wuthering Heights, which serves as part of this isolated landscape. We learn from a conversation between Catherine and Heathcliff soon after that Catherine yearns to marry into the Linton family because she fantasizes about what it would be like to be rich, which is very unlike her in the book. It comes more across as greed in the film than anything else. And she proceeds to ask Heathcliff what he would do if he were rich, and some way, somehow, Emerald Fennell decides to drop in a line alluding to volume 2 of the novel in a way that ultimately romanticizes the abuse of Heathcliff onto other people. So when Catherine poses a question, hey buddy, what would you do if you were rich? He quite literally responds, he would be cruel to his servants and everybody around him, and he would purchase a big house and he would just live there for the rest of his days, which is an interesting creative choice. Catherine then sneaks into Thrushcross Grange by herself, which is different from the book where she goes and spy on the Lintons with Heathcliff, and she poses as a fragile lady who needs help in the film, as opposed to her literally getting attacked and mangled by dogs. And this is the first time we are introduced to the Lintons officially in the film, specifically Edgar Linton and Isabella. No last name because she's a ward in the movie and not Edgar's sister, which again, creative liberties I cannot seem to comprehend. Either way, I don't know that it makes that much of a difference. The movie still paints her, despite being a ward, as almost like Edgar's sister. He loves her like a sister. But other than making capricious creative choices, I cannot wrap my head around exactly why Isabella would not be his sister. I'll circle back to this, but our first impression of Isabella is her ranting about Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet and really diving deep into the philosophies behind the novel to Edgar, who's kind of tired of what she's saying, and after seeing Catherine playing Fragile Lady, he decides to take her in. Not their parents, but Edgar himself. The film follows the structure of the book in that way, where Catherine stays with the Lintons over an extended period of time, where during that time she obviously leaves Heathcliff behind, no communication, no reach out whatsoever. And when she comes back to Wuthering Heights, she is a transformed lady. She is now refined, polished, clean, the exact opposite of Heathcliff. Heathcliff is obviously mad that Catherine left for so long and left him stranded. Then Edgar Linton comes in and proposes to Catherine. Catherine proceeds to accept his proposal and then confides in Nellie that she is unsure if she is making the right decision with marrying Edgar Linton, and she goes on the whole monologue that we see in the book. It's not different in any way, but I do think because the characters' motivations in the film are entirely different, that line falls on flat ears. And we'll circle back to that as well. Heathcliff overhears this conversation where Catherine drops the infamous line that it would degrade her to marry Heathcliff, and he steals a horse and runs away in a fit of anger and sadness. He rides off into the sunset with his horse in a very Gone with the Wind way. It is during Heathcliff's time away that Catherine and Edgar get married, and there is a lot of on-the-nose imagery about dollhouses and Catherine feeling trapped in this marriage, which again is done in a very literal way with the way the house is modeled after a dollhouse and then the dollhouse inside the dollhouse. The movie doesn't want to leave anything to the imagination, and I think it really suffers from something that we're seeing in movies and media a whole lot, with not giving its viewers any credit at all. The tortured lover comes back. He now looks a gentleman. He looks very polished. We know he has earned a fortune that the movie does not care to explain how. Obviously, we know from the book it is likely through nefarious and maybe immoral means. Some people even speculate he could have been involved with slavery because at the time, because Heathcliff is not understood as white, there were likely not many ways he could have garnered the amount of money he did other than through illegal means. That said, he purchases Wuthering Heights for Mr. Earnshaw, where he lives with the old man. Now, the movie never goes in full depth into this specific subject matter, which I think was a missed opportunity, but we do see what likely might have been a hint at Heathcliff abusing old Earnshaw in the same way that he does Hindley in the novel. We know that when Heathcliff moves back to Wuthering Heights in the novel, he exploits Hindley's alcohol abuse and gambling as a means to then claim some sense of ownership and revenge over his son in the novel, Hareton. That obviously does not happen in the movie because of obvious reasons, given what we've talked about. But there is this one scene where he explicitly tells Mr. Earnshaw to go drown himself. I think it was whiskey. And it was a slight nod to something that we know happens in the book, but the movie never does any of this in a very overt way because it prioritizes other narrative choices over explicitly painting Heathcliff as the vengeful abuser he is after he comes back from gathering a fortune. He starts visiting Catherine quite frequently, and it is during that time where Isabella develops an infatuation with Heathcliff to the point where her and Catherine start developing this tension because obviously Catherine does not want to give up Heathcliff in any way. Surprise, surprise, Mr. Earnshaw dies because of course he had to, and in a haze of grief, Catherine decides to strike up a sexual affair with Heathcliff. But what I thought would be sensuality and mentions of BDSM that would perhaps make me disregard the film's inaccuracies to the book felt completely flat. Like, the movie's promise to be sultry and to be sexy in no way delivered. Literally what we see of this film in terms of its eroticism is first, the hanging scene, which according to test audiences included the man who was being hung ejaculating after being killed. And then Joseph and Sila, who Joseph, instead of being a religious bigot, is instead a master in the film, do horseplay. Catherine and Heathcliff just like having sex at all times, and Heathcliff has a fixation with licking her, which is in no way as kinky as I thought it would be. And then Isabella, which we'll also get more into later, has a degradation dog kink, which I have a lot to say about. And how could I forget Catherine jerking off behind a boulder, which then becomes Heathcliff licking her cum-filled fingers. You know what? It was not kinky enough. If you wanted to give me something truly sultry, even in that the movie fails, which was truly a disappointment. At this point in time, Catherine knows she is pregnant with Edgar's child while she is having the affair with Heathcliff. Nellie threatens to tell Edgar, and then Catherine, in an effort to preserve the life she is living, ends this affair with Heathcliff, which then turns into Heathcliff telling Isabella they're going to get married. He is going to think of Catherine the entire time. He announces his intentions very quickly with Isabella, and the two end up eloping, which again is not so dissimilar from the book. Kathy obviously enters a state of distress because of this, and while Heathcliff is out there illiterate, by the way, a choice to be made with Heathcliff being illiterate in the film, I do not understand that either, but Heathcliff then has to tell Isabella to write him these love letters to send over to Catherine. Nellie withholds all these letters, burns them, does not want the characters to see each other. Catherine then descends into sickness and madness, and in an effort to garner attention, does not eat, does not drink water, and does not take care of herself. Catherine also confides in Nellie that she lost the baby, which Nellie does not believe. So Nellie treats Kathy as stupid during this conversation because she's like, did you even bleed? And Kathy's like, no. He's like, you stupid hoe, then that means that you're fine. So she withholds this information from Edgar. Edgar still thinks like, yeah, maybe my wife's going through it, but like, she's still pregnant, right? Then Nellie realizes that Catherine is going into sepsis because she did in fact lose the baby. And in an effort to rectify her choices, because she realizes that she is messed up big time with her treatment of these characters, he runs to Wuthering Heights to tell Heathcliff that Catherine is dying. He rides off into the sunset once more to reach Kathy before she dies, which, differently from the book, he does not get to do. And when he arrives at the Grange, Catherine is already dead. Jacob Elordi then recites one of the most interesting passages in ontology from Wuthering Heights, which does not make any sense in the film, since the film does not explore anything metaphysical or ontology related, and instead it just comes across as the tortured hero who has been separated from their lover, again by the two people of color the entire film, begging her to haunt him forever and take any form because he cannot live without her. Also, this is just me speculating, but I wonder if Emerald Fennell felt like she had to compensate for Heathcliff's lack of color, because he is quite translucent. But I do wonder if she felt the need to compensate for Heathcliff's casting and then casting Shazad Latif as Edgar and Hong Chow as Nellie, because whether it was unintentional or intentional or an implicit bias on display, the optics of how this looks is not really flattering for Emerald Fennell, because ultimately the two villainous characters in the film, the two forces that keep Heathcliff and Catherine apart from each other, are the only two people of color. And while yes, we can argue that Mr. Earnshaw also had a somewhat role as a villain in the film, that abuse and that villainy only brings Catherine and Heathcliff together because of Heathcliff's protection of Catherine. So even if he was an outwardly mean character to both of our leads, the implications are very different, and I think that's very interesting. And I know it's been the talk of the town because it was certainly a choice. Because ultimately what that says to me is that you did not picture your tortured, tragic lover as a man of color, but your vision, what you imagined when you read the novel, instead whitewashed Heathcliff's character. But your vision did mean, and I'm just going based on what she said, a lot of assumptions here, but follow my lead, because if what she adapted is what she imagined, does that then mean that what she imagined was a Thai woman and a Pakistani man keeping these two lovers apart as jailers in their own right? Call me crazy if you want to, but I'm just going based on what Fennell herself said. Love you, back to the video. And that, my friends, is the end of Wuthering Heights by Emerald Fennell. Now, I will make it a point to say, narrative structure-wise, the movie is not so dissimilar from Wuthering Heights. However, Nellie is one of the most interesting characters, both in the film and the book. In fact, I would argue she is one of my favorite characters because of how she frames Wuthering Heights as a story. In my opinion, the film strips of the story of one of its most crucial and interesting narrative devices, which is that the story we get told in Wuthering Heights, in this little novel right here, is twice removed, if not 4 times removed sometimes, because we know from the book we first have got the facts, then the facts told by Nellie, then Lockwood's transcription of Nellie's story, and then we also have characters' recollection of other events that they tell Nellie. Therefore, those events are also warped through her perception. There is literally no point in the novel where we get unmediated objective access to Catherine and Heathcliff, and that to me is one of the most fascinating aspects of the reading experience, especially because Nellie's neutrality is non-existent. We often see her moralizing, judging Kathy, intervening poorly, not intervening at all. More often than not, we see her withholding empathy, all while she frames herself as the voice of reason, which is incredible in terms of character construction. I mean, I love unreliable narrators and I love unlikable characters, and Wuthering Heights definitely has an abundance of both. An abundance in such a way that for me raises the question of what biases does Nellie have as a character, and how does that shape our understanding of the events when they are filtered by somebody who fundamentally disapproves and distrusts of the great love that it presents. So if you ask me, I think it's yet another missed opportunity by Fennell in her adaptation of Wuthering Heights, which is Wuthering Heights and it isn't, to do something truly narratively rich and complex. And that is a shame, because when we see a new adaptation of Wuthering Heights, the question also comes up, what is this adaptation trying to achieve, and why now? Why is an adaptation of Wuthering Heights in 2026 important? And I don't know that either of those questions are clearly, concisely answered after watching the movie, in my experience, twice over. So if Wuthering Heights is to be understood as anything other than a tale of star-crossed lovers and forbidden romance, romanticized abuse, obsession, and eroticism as the film paints it, we must read the book through the lens of otherness, and one does not need to look further than the introduction of Wuthering Heights, written by Pauline Nestor. The introduction states that indeed the work's attraction as a love story is not difficult to isolate. On one level, the novel appears to celebrate a transcendent love which surpasses the bounds of authority, mundanity, and even death. Catherine and Heathcliff share a bond of consummate endurance and understanding, and in positing such a relationship, the novel both recognizes and explicitly appeals to a universal desire in relationship for the perfect other. Heathcliff is the cuckoo without a history, an enigma so unsettling that Nellie is inclined, as indeed some critics have been subsequently, to invent a past for him. And what is that past, you might ask? I will enlighten you, because the other, in all of its different iterations, is essential to understanding Wuthering Heights. I in no way doubt that if you are on the internet and have seen any Wuthering Heights related content, you have likely seen videos come up talking about how Heathcliff is not supposed to be a white man, and while yes, objectively speaking, racialized language and the subject of race was viewed very differently at the time of Emily Bronte writing this novel, we cannot modernize the language used in the novel or assume something that the text leaves quite ambiguous. There are plenty of racialized remarks used to describe Heathcliff that does not go unnoticed if you truly engage with the text in ways that allude, specifically with the Brontes being an abolitionist family, that Heathcliff is more likely than not a white man. The first description we ever get of Heathcliff is in page 5, which is literally chapter 1 of Wuthering Heights, as described by Lockwood. Mr. Heathcliff forms a singular contrast to his abode and style of living. He is a dark-skinned, and here's where I make a small pause, because the book consistently uses a Romani slur against Heathcliff, which does not confirm in any way that he is Romani, but the racial relation this word had at that time, in most cases of classic literature that I have seen, it almost always alludes to somebody being of darker skin. So he is a dark-skinned slur in aspect, in dress and manners a gentleman, that is, as much a gentleman as many a country squire. Chapter 4 of the novel is also very telling, specifically pages 36 and 37, which present the sequence of events leading up to Heathcliff's arrival at the Earnshaw household. We know Mr. Earnshaw was leaving on a trip to Liverpool, which at the time was famously the heart of the British transatlantic slave trade, so a lot of speculation has happened over the last 178 years, with people speculating that Heathcliff might have even been a slave that Mr. Earnshaw brought into the household. Mr. Earnshaw's first description of Heathcliff is equating his darkness as if it came from the devil. It is also very interesting that within these passages, Heathcliff is stripped of humanity and consistently referred as an it, not a he. Nellie's first impression of Heathcliff was saying that he was dirty and ragged, once more a slur, consistently calls Heathcliff it, and makes it a point to remark on how she was frightened by Heathcliff. Catherine also immediately recognizes Heathcliff as other, potentially beneath her, as her first reaction when she saw Heathcliff was to laugh, smile, and spit at him, which earned her a good old slap from Mr. Earnshaw, because Mr. Earnshaw really did mean it when he brought Heathcliff into this household, with him becoming another one of his children. And again, we'll get into preferential treatment later, but Catherine's initial cruelty of Heathcliff also did not go unnoticed. The movie also tries to paint Heathcliff as potentially not speaking good English, which makes no sense under the context of him being white in the film, because in the book it is literally stated, "Did you notice his language, Linton? I am shocked that my children should have heard it." So the implication of Heathcliff being foreign in some way within the text is quite present, even in his language being different from that of the traditional English these people spoke. There are other words used to describe Heathcliff in the novel, specifically by Hindley, Catherine's brother. He is called a dog, once more a slur, an imp of Satan, a vagabond, a beggarly interloper, repeatedly called an it by Hindley. So Heathcliff's alienation of the household was very clear from day one by everybody other than Mr. Earnshaw. And what's so beautiful about Wuthering Heights and its complexities in Bronte's writing is that Heathcliff's sense of otherness continues to evolve throughout the novel. This sense of other that permeates his existence starts out as something more racial, and then we see it through the lens of class. We see it through the lens of the metaphysical with his relationship with Catherine, and then we also see it through a moral scope toward the end of the novel, where his abuse of the second generation, which is completely absent from the film, though that's not unusual. Most adaptations, I would argue maybe every adaptation, though I'm unsure about that claim, does not adapt the story of the second generation. I think it's, yes, more difficult to do, not impossible. I really do think Wuthering Heights should be made into a show, honestly. An HBO Wuthering Heights show, I do think, hear me out, but it becomes more moral toward the end of the story when the abuse of this second generation intensifies. So it never just remains a single thing. The movie wants to paint it as a single thing, which is, once more, a missed opportunity by having cast Elordi. I think another passage from the novel further solidifies what there is to strive for by more than just Heathcliff in regards to class, race, and status, because he says that, in other words, he must wish for Edgar Linton's great blue eyes and even forehead. I do, and that won't help me to them. And then this is where Nellie speculates and invents a backstory for him, but it's very specific because she says that his father might have been an emperor of China, maybe his mother was an Indian queen, or maybe he was kidnapped by wicked sailors and brought over to England. And that sentence alone, paired up with him being called a little lascar earlier on in the novel and a castaway, I think alludes to the fact that these characters were aware that Heathcliff was not from the bouts of Wuthering Heights and the English. Fascinating for the people that want to dispute that. No, Heathcliff being white makes sense, does it? And this is where we move Heathcliff's sense of other from racial to class, because as Catherine comes back from Thrushcross Grange in the novel, she remarks on Heathcliff's other through the lens of how she was educated at the Grange by the Lintons, because when she comes back from the Grange, she tells Heathcliff immediately how very black and cross he looks, how funny and grim. But maybe that's because she's used to Edgar and Isabella Linton now, who, as we know, are equated through conscious effort or not by Emily Bronte to class and distinct beauty through their Eurocentric features with their blonde hair and their blue eyes, which only makes Heathcliff want to strive for that even harder, because now Catherine associates the Lintons with refinement and desirability and overall superiority, even though her family, the Earnshaws, were still quite wealthy because they've been established at Wuthering Heights since the 1500s. With Mrs. Linton grabbing Catherine as her little experiment to polish her up as a gentle lady, she now is aware of an upper-class domestic order that she wasn't prior to living with the Lintons. And when she comes back and she says, "Oh my god, Heathcliff, you look so different," it's essentially her saying, "I have changed and you have not." And that in itself starts quite a lot of resentment between the two of them, and I really quite like that. But she makes it a point to say, now in relation to class, I notice how there is a social order here that you do not belong to, or where in the latter, you are definitely toward the bottom. Which is why Catherine's description in the book matters so much and why it is so intentional. Because the Lintons being associated with a higher class and disrupting this isolation that was previously observed within the Grange and within Wuthering Heights, Catherine understands that their sense of other as outsiders is something that even she must strive for, and she now understands that because Catherine in the book is described as a high-spirited girl of brown hair and brown eyes. She doesn't mind getting dirty, she doesn't mind being wild, which is why she finds herself in kindred with Heathcliff, because she recognizes herself in him. So while her description motivation is not racialized like Heathcliff's is, there's still this sense of other within Catherine's description that allows her to feel this closeness to Heathcliff in a way that she does not feel to the Lintons initially. Which is why Catherine's infamous line when she's talking and confiding in Nellie about whether or not she should marry Edgar Linton and her degrading herself to marry Heathcliff has got absolutely nothing to do with sexual desire and her degrading herself by having these wild bouts of sex with him, but rather because she understands this social hierarchy now, and she understands the implication of marrying somebody like Heathcliff, which is further reinforced by Edgar Linton when he presents Cathy with a choice. It is either him or it is me, but it cannot possibly be both. It is impossible for it to be the both of us. Will you give up Heathcliff hereafter, or will you give up me? It is impossible for you to be my friend and his at the same time, and I absolutely require to know which you choose. And in my recent read of the text, what became increasingly clear was that Edgar is demanding allegiance, alignment, social order, and construct. He is reinforcing these lines that have already been in place far before he got to Wuthering Heights. In his eyes, Heathcliff and Edgar cannot possibly coexist in the same social and moral spaces, which is why Catherine must make a choice. So while the film likes to paint Edgar as this romantic barrier between Catherine, this force that keeps them separate because he selfishly wants Catherine for himself and because he's jealous of Heathcliff, in the book it's more about social structure. He is reinforcing once more these clean-cut lines that Catherine learned in her 5 weeks with the Lintons when she was younger, and he is not letting that go unannounced or undecided. So even the character motivation is very differently. And again, I think when you cast Shazad Latif, which honestly could have been the perfect Heathcliff in the film, and you paint him as this barrier between the two white love interests, and this is the one guy who's keeping them apart, on top of Nellie, the only other Asian character in the film, it definitely makes the motivation come across very differently, and you once more erase the theme of class, because when you explore it in a very surface level way with none of the nuance that the text itself includes. Like the introduction of Wuthering Heights by Pauline Nestor also mentions, there's a sense of other through the metaphysical. There's this bigger sense of self that Catherine recognizes in her relationship with Heathcliff, something that she can't quite explain, something that baffles Nellie when they're having their conversation, and something that in my opinion in the introduction also reinforces, so I'm glad to know that I'm not alone, comes across as the opposite of sexually mature, which is obviously the opposite of what the movie is doing, and it also comes across quite immature and coercive, again, in trying to paint this romance as something beyond the two of them, beyond this realm of existence, in an effort to want to coexist in both realms. The one where she gets to have all of the privilege of being married to Edgar Linton, and the one where she in soul remains tied to Heathcliff. But we know that that system cannot be sustainable in itself. And this is why the other is so important, because this is the system in which the characters in Wuthering Heights exist, where racialized remarks, social class, and hierarchy, and inheritance, and bloodline become one with the characters' motivations and how they present themselves within the story in tandem with every action happening in the background. So in Fennell's Wuthering Heights frames their love as doomed because of personal intensity and all-consuming passion. It is an oversimplified take, especially for somebody like Fennell, who claims to have read this book more than 100 times, but who am I to know? And what I've been leading up to this whole time, if you might have been able to put the dots together, is that their love is not doomed because it is obsessive, it's because it is structurally unsustainable. Heathcliff is not simply a hot brooding outsider like Jacob Elordi. He is a racialized and socially unstable figure whose very presence destabilizes English hierarchy, and that never escapes Cathy's notice. Her decision to marry Edgar is not a rejection of passion, but an alignment with property, status, and legitimacy, because to marry Heathcliff would be to descend into the systemic exclusion that he resides in, which is the complete opposite she pledges to when she marries Edgar. So to me, their love does not fail because it is simply too intense, but rather because the world Bronte has built has no space for it to exist without consequence, which is why even in the first live show I made when I first read the book, I talked about how these two people could not be together until death. And it very much is that way, assuming that they reunite in the afterlife or wherever the two meet, if they even go to the same place. There are obviously many reasons why Wuthering Heights is considered such an important classic, and why it solidified its spot as an important piece of media over the last couple of decades when it started garnering a lot of popularity. But amongst those is the fact that Emily Bronte was considered way ahead of her time in matters related to metaphysics and ontology, which I recently learned that word when I was doing research for this video, because I knew there was something other in Catherine's explanations of fusioning with Heathcliff, but I didn't know exactly what word to put to it beyond metaphysics. And apparently there's a word for it, which my friends were also familiar with. I literally told Gabby the word ontology and she was like, oh yeah. I was like, how the hell do you know that? I feel like I'm gonna be like a toddler who recently learned a word and I'm gonna walk around being like, ontology. Ontology, I'm gonna be so insufferable. But these two elements cannot be separated from the novel's core. I think it shows up consistently in Catherine's conversations with Nellie throughout the story. It also comes up in the most famous line by Heathcliff in chapter 16, which is hard to ignore. And it's so important because the novel does not paint their connection as primarily carnal or exclusively sexual longing. There is a need to fusion, specifically for Catherine, to Heathcliff and her projecting her own sense of self onto him, which subsequently robs him of agency, and that is an interesting aspect to their relationship, especially considering how Catherine is so entitled and such a brat, honestly, which we know. However, despite the movie's efforts to include these iconic lines within the film, because the film never explicitly explores any of this material as it likes to do other things, a lot of it kind of falls on deaf ears. When Catherine confides in Nellie in her confession that Edgar has proposed in chapter 9, she says that Heathcliff is more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same. And Linton's is as different as a moonbeam from lightning or frost from fire. But one of my favorite sections of the book comes in on page 82, where she tells Nellie, who is to separate us, pray? They'll meet the fate of Milo. Ironic that she invokes Milo because his overconfidence kills him, which is not unlike Catherine, who thinks that she can coexist in these two spaces. She can claim the class, all of the privileges once more of marrying Edgar Linton, but in soul she can remain with Heathcliff. She is so confident in this that she thinks she can raise Heathcliff's status with Edgar's money, which Nellie tries to knock some sense into her because she's like, girl, do you really think your husband will agree to that? He will have to understand. Edgar will have to understand my relationship to Heathcliff, and he will once he learns of my true feelings for him. And it is this same overconfidence of Catherine's that ultimately causes the demise of so many different characters, including that of herself. Catherine then continues, I cannot express it, but surely you and everybody have a notion that there is, or should be, an existence of yours beyond you. What were the use of my creation if I were entirely contained here? My great miseries in this world have been Heathcliff's miseries, and I watched and felt each from the beginning. My great thought in living is himself. If all else perished and he remained, I should still continue to be, and if all else remained and he were annihilated, the universe would turn to a mighty stranger. I should not seem a part of it. My love for Linton is like the foliage in the woods. Time will change it, I'm well aware, as winter changes the trees. My love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath, a source of little visible delight but necessary. Nellie, I am Heathcliff. He is always, always in my mind, not as a pleasure any more than I am always a pleasure to myself, but as my own being. So don't talk of our separation again. It is impracticable. And these passages highlight the true complexities of Catherine's character. She is somebody who is entitled. She is somebody who wants to strip Heathcliff of identity so that she can project herself onto him. It is quite infantile, quite immature. The very premise of her love is entirely misplaced and flawed, and it is that exact same reason why the love cannot persist. It cannot sustain itself, which is why the root of their love is so volatile, because she does not retain or want to retain within Heathcliff their own sense of individuality. And the ontological nature of Bronte's work shows up again in chapter 16 with Heathcliff's very famous delivery, where he says, "May she wake in torment. Why, she's a liar to the end. Where is she? Not there, not in heaven, not perished. Where? You said you cared nothing for my sufferings, and I pray one prayer. I repeat it till my tongue stiffens. Catherine Earnshaw, may you not rest as long as I am living. You said I killed you. Haunt me then. The murdered do haunt their murderers, I believe. I know that ghosts have wandered on earth. Be with me always. Take any form. Drive me mad. Only do not leave me in this abyss where I cannot find you. I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul." Editor Mel here to interject, because I've been editing the video all day, and I realize now, as I am putting together the different sections, that I was circling the topic of ontology a lot, but I never fully landed my point, especially not as I had it written down, not as I underlined in my novel. So I am here to finally get to the point, because honestly, love my ADHD the most. It's quite helpful sometimes. But when I get sidetracked and I've made a main point, I never remember what the main point was, and I just keep on going. So before it works against me too much, I really do think the ontology of Wuthering Heights is absolutely crucial to understanding Catherine and Heathcliff's romance. There are a lot of articles to back this up, with people exploring the philosophies behind Wuthering Heights and what essentially sets it apart from a lot of these tragic, doomed, possessive, obsessive romances that you see a lot of the time. And what's so interesting about the novel is how it separates romantic love from ontological love, because we know romantic love, if you read romances and the such, then you know it's so much about preserving a difference, right? Everybody retains their own sense of individuality. If you've been on my channel here before, those are the types of romance books that I typically look for, where people remain individual and they do not give up a sense of self for the person that they get with during the story. Ontological love, in turn, collapses separation. It does not require, demand, necessitate people to remain autonomous, which is what makes this branch of metaphysics so interesting when you're trying to explore the nature of being and you tie that to projection, right? When we talk about the other, as we talked in part 1 of this video, and it demands the question outside of all of the racialized remarks that we see, outside of the class and morality question of Heathcliff as a character, it begs the question of who he is at his core, and Catherine fully believes he is simply an extension of herself. He is Catherine as much as she is Heathcliff, which is funny because when we call back to what I was talking about earlier with Heathcliff being stripped of humanity, he is not a he, but rather an it. Catherine does not view him as a man either, because he is Catherine. It's really fascinating, and I am sure, even though this thought permeates my brain when I think about Wuthering Heights, I am sure there's even more to this that I cannot even wrap my head around. So if we observe the relationship through the lens of ontology, Catherine choosing Edgar and choosing to marry him and never getting to be with Heathcliff, and all of these different claims of I am Heathcliff and having something that outlives you, and if Heathcliff lives past me, then there is something of me that remains in this world. It is at its core existential betrayal. If they are one and the same, this is not just, oh, you chose to love somebody else. It is you're betraying your nature of being and your existence by choosing to be with this other person, regardless of what the circumstances or the justification of you being with this person is or are. So as dramatic as it seems, which is exactly the point of Gothic literature, it is so absolute and the language is very specific. What the novel frames is not the romantic, oh, I cannot live without you, I cannot live without my soul. It's not as literal. It means I do not exist without you. At least that's the way that I interpret that, because we cannot exist as separate beings, because this is the idea that Catherine has been selling to Heathcliff this entire time. So when Catherine says in the film, you did not give me the chance to rectify the biggest mistake of my life, the movie suggests that she regrets marrying Edgar because she chose the wrong man to love, whereas in the novel, in plain terms, as the movie would like to do it, she miscalculated the cost of separation. She did not realize that marrying Edgar and choosing social structure would force her to sacrifice Heathcliff in the way that she had to. Even though she understands the system in which she lives in, Kathy genuinely thought she would be able to bend reality to be able to coexist. She chose the social structure, she chose the class, she chose the wealth over Heathcliff, and that in itself makes it hard for her to reconcile who she is now. And that, to me personally, is the big issue in the sense of identity and why exactly the system that she creates is not sustainable for this romance to exist. I was going to say endure, but just exist in general. So yes, it is extremely toxic, but not for the reasons that the film would like to show. Which is why when these metaphysical quotes show up in the film with none of the groundwork for this sense of other, these quotes come across as more people being tragic and dramatic for the sake of being so, instead of there actually being any real depth to this feeling that isn't quite tangible. Which is why I'm going to call back to something I said earlier, because this movie's fundamental flaw, in my opinion, is that it consistently mistakes intensity for depth and tries to mask its lack of depth with these really erotic, carnal scenes and this really booming music by Charlie XCX, without giving the viewers none of what makes Wuthering Heights as a novel so special. I've been hinting at this the whole time, but something that struck me as really interesting with Fennell's adaptation of Wuthering Heights is its preference for immediacy. She's always drawing these clean-cut lines, overstating character intention, even building sets in a very on-the-nose way. Mr. Earnshaw declares himself the kindest man alive at some point in the film, something that only Nellie brands him as in the novel. We know in the book when he is taking a leave for Liverpool, he starts asking everybody, like, children, come on over. What do you guys want me to bring you from my travels? And he does not forget Nellie, and Nellie takes note of that. Nellie's like, yeah, he's a really kind man. And he always remained quite kind in the book, save for when his health declined and he obviously observed a lot of cruelty directed at Heathcliff, and he took a lot of issue in that, not only because of the mistreatment in itself, but also because his authority was being challenged repeatedly. So while in the novel his kindness is real and stated by other characters in the book itself, in the film it's more emotional coercion to make Catherine specifically feel bad. Catherine herself in the movie outwardly states her regret of marrying Edgar in very plain terms, something that we know is sort of implicit within the story. Arguments in the film erupt without build-up, and every bit of desire and violence is externalized physically and without restraint throughout the entirety of the film as well. In contrast, the system the novel establishes does not demand its characters to announce their intentions so plainly, because a huge element of the novel is inheritance. Hindley's abuse of Heathcliff is not only the jealousy of a displaced son, nor solely racial hostility. It is actually his attempt at reinstating the hierarchy he's very familiar with after his father destabilizes it by favoring Heathcliff instead of his own children. We know Mr. Earnshaw sends Hindley off to college because of the escalating conflict between him and Heathcliff, so when Mr. Earnshaw dies, Hindley does not immediately explode into villainy. Instead, he inherits the authority to degrade Heathcliff, and he exercises that very methodically, which in this case is not so dissimilar from Heathcliff in Volume 2, when he exploits Hindley's shortcomings with his gambling and alcohol addiction, and then utilizes that hindrance in order to abuse Hindley's son Hareton by degrading him in the same way that Hindley degraded Heathcliff once he gained authority of the household. But all of this does not happen in the blink of an eye. It does not happen so explicitly at first, but rather through very careful calculation on Heathcliff's part. So in all, we can argue that Wuthering Heights' violence is not explosive, but it's rather a slow corrosion, which I think makes the novel even more interesting. We know that the novel spans about 30 years' time, which is an awfully long time to hold a vendetta against several different generations of the families you find yourself surrounded with. But that's why it's such a big cautionary tale of revenge. And one of the most interesting elements of Wuthering Heights and its inheritance of violence, specifically in regards to the Earnshaws, is that it all starts with old Earnshaw, something that would have been fascinating to see in the film, because although we know that his love is intense, it is preferential, it is also defensive and reactive, which is not unlike Catherine's own love of Heathcliff, which is why the generational aspect of the story beyond the revenge portion is so interesting, because none of these characters know how to love in a sustainable way. We know that specifically for old Earnshaw, his love depended entirely on his authority and him forcing people to assimilate Heathcliff. So when he dies, this blanket of safety his authority provided for Heathcliff's fragile security completely fractures. And Catherine's love, like I mentioned, being so similar, cannot exist within the social structures that she chooses to uphold, which is why it also collapses on itself. Both of these loves prove unsustainable over time, and the reason why this love cannot exist is because it does not construct the conditions necessary for its own survival. And that would have been so cool to explore if only Mr. Earnshaw had been portrayed right. And one of the most interesting elements of Gothic literature, far beyond that of Wuthering Heights, is the fact that the climate, the setting, the houses feel like characters in and of themselves outside of the tangible human characters that we meet. And so the fact that right from the jump, Emerald Fennell frames Wuthering Heights, the estate, as this already decrepit place that they live in, which Catherine wants to escape because it's not up to standard, because it doesn't scream class and wealth and money. And again, there is something to strive for with this huge, insane mansion that the Lintons live in. It erases the structural decay that is fascinating in the novel because it's intrinsically affected by the choices that the characters make. So when Mr. Earnshaw dies, and then Hindley assumes authority and uses that to abuse Heathcliff, and when Heathcliff in turn purchases Wuthering Heights and abuses Hindley and the second generation, it only provides physical decay around them because he does not want to provide conditions in which these characters can thrive, because those were the cards that he was dealt when he was younger. So despite that decay being gradual in the book, the movie chooses to do that quite immediately, especially because Mr. Earnshaw is from the jump painted as an abusive father. I also wanted to chat a little bit more about Isabella in the movie. I think Isabella is the most question mark element of the movie for me. I wish I could say in more concrete terms that I fully understood Fennell's attempt at changing her character, but I think a lot of it is more ambiguous for me, which I, at this point in time, cannot wrap my head around whether I find that successful or not in terms of storytelling. Isabella in the book experiences abuse at the hands of Heathcliff, which again is very deliberate, tormenting Edgar for reinforcing these barriers that Heathcliff cannot himself push past because of who he is as a person. So he chooses to elope with Isabella, and in the book he abuses Isabella both physically and emotionally, to the point where he hangs her dog and makes her see. So picture everybody's surprised faces when they realize that no, Isabella's dog was not hung in the film, but she is the dog because she has a degradation kink. I still can't quite wrap my head around it. I know in the introduction to Wuthering Heights, Pauline Nestor mentions that we know Isabella is just as inclined as Heathcliff towards violence, although not as capable of it, and she provides a passage in which Isabella sees a weapon and her thinking, considering how powerful she would feel if she were to hold it and have it within her grasp. The book also makes it a point to describe Isabella as infantile, though we know that she is prone to very strong emotions if the opportunity arose. So what I'm still trying to figure out, and I would love to see you guys' take on this on the comment section if you guys have watched the film, I still can't decide if Fennell was attempting to give Isabella more agency, as we know that historically what has been talked about within the BDSM communities is that although there is a clean-cut line between a dominant and a submissive, when there is a scene going on, the submissive is technically the one in charge because they're the ones that can dictate when it starts and when it stops, although it seems that the power is at the hands of the dominant. So in the film, they elope, and Heathcliff leaves it very clear that every time he has sex with Isabella, he'll be thinking exclusively of Catherine. But we know the nature of their relationship is very sexual. The movie never states that he is abusive of Isabella. I mean, maybe we can garner that he might be, but because the movie never really showcases anything other than her demanding sex of Heathcliff, which low-key kind of looks like a Stockholm Syndrome situation, which I'm not sure if that's the intent. We know that the nature of the relationship is very different in the movie versus the book, and I wonder if that was her attempt at giving her more agency, allowing Isabella to be in control, maybe going along that specific quote within the introduction of Isabella being more capable of violence than initially meets the eye, although she's not as capable of exerting it herself, and maybe wanting to play a little bit more with that. But I also feel I am trying to make sense of why these creative choices were made, and I might be projecting something perhaps a bit deeper than the movie actually intended. I am unsure. I am unsure also if this was supposed to be Fennell's interpretation of abuse. It's confusing, but I digress because the speculation has taken me nowhere over the last 11 days, but I would love to know you guys' opinions on that if you have any in the comment section. Ultimately, I think it is another missed opportunity of the films to not explore any of these characters and these generations in any real depth, because it oversimplifies a lot of this to simple, tragic, doomed love, when in reality it isn't. Literally no action these characters take goes unpunished. Ultimately, whether the adaptation is successful in what it set out to achieve is entirely subjective. If what Emerald Fennell wanted was for people to talk about the adaptation, then mission accomplished, girl, because everybody's talking about it. I just don't know that the reception is all too well. I do think in regards to the eroticism of the film, it just simply was not kinky enough. I was genuinely expecting something more outrageous, but I do think all of its erotic scenes seemed more stereotypical with what people associate with BDSM rather than anything actually kinky. I would argue Saltburn in that regard was likely more successful in its scandalized takes of intimacy and sex and wanting to become closer to something physical. I was ready to play devil's advocate and be like, guys, wait, why was it actually kind of good? And then even in that regard, the movie is unsuccessful in my opinion, which is likely the most disappointing. I have seen people talk online about how they found the movie so sexy and so sultry, and how they left the movie theater hot and bothered, and how people came out of the experience with a newfound attraction and respect for Jacob Elordi. Honestly, I don't see the appeal. I do think he's attractive, I can see that. And putting the obvious miscast of Heathcliff aside, I just don't know that I'd look at that man and go like, yeah, lick me up, daddy. Be on your knees and say you love me 3 different times. Like, it just seemed so pitiful. So if what she was trying to do was make Heathcliff quite a pitiful figure who yearns for Catherine, then yeah, mission accomplished. Just don't know that it is as profound as it could have been, which is interesting. What I can say, however, is one, you guys need a doctor's visit. I can be your doctor, okay? I can give you a prescription of smut books that you could read to get off in the way that so many people got off on this movie. Because honestly, I don't know if it's too strong an emotion, but I just think it's a very stale representation of what erotica can be. So I'm going to need you guys expeditiously to go to your local bookstore and dig up those erotica books and just pick the first one. I don't care which one it is, and just read up on that material, because honestly, this wasn't all that. And the second thing I can say is that I don't know this movie needed to be called Wuthering Heights. I don't care if it had quotations or not. Did it need to be Wuthering Heights? Because this reads as a self-servicing director whose aims to project themselves onto material bigger than themselves. It's not the first time we have seen this. I would also claim the same for Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein, which is an entirely separate conversation. There are so many directors that have grabbed inspiration from other films and other classics, and they are not naming these adaptations the same as the source material because they want certain thematic aspects from them, but not all of it. So it's not wholly representative of something that they're drawing inspiration from. Much like, and would you guess, Emerald Fennel Saltburn. Because girlfriend, if you did not know, let me enlighten you. Saltburn is inspired by Rebecca, Brideshead Revisited, even the talented Mr. Ripley and the Go-Between. So if Saltburn was named something else because it could have been, and it was, then why was Wuthering Heights not named something else if you want to strip it of its themes? In this entire video to say, I will call back to what I said in the beginning. I am not demanding a faithful adaptation at 100% capacity. I do not care if lines change. I do not care if scenes change, so long as it's done in a respectful way. But ultimately, what this adaptation is a selfish sampling of Bronte, which is to say it's not inherently bad or evil, but she is most certainly taking what serves her vision of desire, obsession, and gothic spectacle, and a very aesthetic movie, which, yeah, the movie is pretty, but it's empty. All in all, I think it shows how an adaptation can be faithful on a level of effect, because I do think elements of Bronte are present. I do think the passion, the drama, parts of her voice with the direct quotes from the book are present, all while erasing the novel's underlying philosophy, which you wouldn't think would have to be the case considering she is not adapting the second generation storyline, because it's so much more grander than herself, as she has stated. You would think she'd have enough time to establish everything else, but apparently it fell second to everything else she prioritized in the film. And the jokes really do write themselves, because I think the most ironic part of it all is that Fennell herself in an interview said, and I quote, "I know that if somebody else made it, I'd be furious," in reference to somebody adapting the entirety of the book, including all of its themes. So given that statement, I would say that maybe the internet's backlash is not as surprising. And that is it for today's class, everybody. I've never done something like this. It was definitely all-consuming in ways that I definitely could not have anticipated, but I had so much fun drafting this, rereading volume 1 of the novel, and sharing a bit more of my own thoughts on Wuthering Heights. I would obviously love to know what you guys think about the novel, about Fennell's interpretation of the text. If you have watched the adaptation, not watched it, refused to, if you have read the novel, I would love to know any and all thoughts down in the comment section. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content. I am definitely hoping to make more videos like these. I would love to know if there are any other things you would love to talk about, any other things you'd think would be interesting for a video essay. So drop those in the comments down below. If you reach the end of the video, leave a wilted flower emoji in the comment section. I think it's the perfect emoji for Wuthering Heights. And if you do want to support the channel further, you guys already know I do have a Patreon, which is linked down below always, in case you want to check that out and support the channel, especially for videos like these that take so much time and will make other videos in between a little bit more dispersed just because of the effort that this takes. I have a newfound respect for people who do this consistently, because it's actually insane. And with that said, I also want to give a thank you to my patrons. Thank you guys for believing in me when I did not even believe in myself, because you guys are absolutely incredible. So that is it for today. Les mando besitos a todos, and I will see you guys on the next one. Goodbye, everybody.